Achtung, or should that be tally-ho, tally-ho? Hello there, we have ways of waking you talk listeners. It is I, Al Murray and James Holland, and we're going to cut to the chase and talk about the Battle of Britain. I'm just going to pull up the script that we were sent, because I'm chafing at the bit to do this. I just want to get on with this, because this is sort of the big one. It's where interestingly,
for us Brits, 1940s the daddy, isn't it? I mean, it's just it's the big one. It's the hinge of fate.
I'm Derek D-Day though. I think that when we're back in 1944, when we're back in France,
that's good, but it's kind of sort of from the disaster of the fall of France, a strategic earthquake, to kind of sort of holding out over that summer, and the fact that it is summer not winter, and it's kind of air battles over Kent and Sussex and shenanigans, laying in the Channel, all the rest of it.
But the reason we need to talk about this, aside from in recent weeks we've had some fantastic guests, and many of whom have helped reshape the narrative of the British alone, taking on the overwhelming might of Hitler's forces. Everything's got to be in inverted commas, at least 7 sets for this bit. None more so than Phillips O'Brien, who caused a good deal of debate after pointing out that in fact the British were not alone and were not the underdog. But that doesn't mean the bravery of the few should be seen as anything less than it was, a spectacular effort of skill and courage in the face of a dangerous and determined enemy. But enough from me. James Holland has, of course, written a whole book on this subject. I mean, you really don't need me to bullshit on about this. Although I've done a little bit of I've sort of chopped up different ways of looking at the Battle of Britain. Because we had lumpers and splitters the other day from Gary Sheffield about how you.
Oh yeah, that was quite a good line. I quite like that.
You're a lumper or a splitter. Well, so Battle of Britain schools of thought. There's the optimist school of thought, I've decided to call it, which is you, James. You're up on the British effort. You're up on the way of looking at it. There's nothing there's nothing surprising about Fighter Command winning the Battle of Britain. Actually, when you stop and have a look at what there is, then I've got the pessimist view, which is sort of Len Dayton. We didn't win, but we didn't lose it either, and the Germans had to absolutely win it. And as long as they're stopped from winning it, that's enough. You don't have to win the Battle of Britain. You just have to make sure you don't lose it, right? Which is the sort of Len Dayton view. And I remember the Len Dayton book from when I was a kid, which was very much lots of pressure on RAF fighter stations as the first stage of the battle, then the switch to bombing London, which of course gives Fighter Command the breathing space it requires, which I think is a thing people really very much have in their heads as a way of looking at it. Yeah?
Yeah, the whole narrow margin, the close run thing.
Yeah, well, which takes us to the declinist view, which is, I think, the next step down, which is what the thing Leo McKinstry had in the paper the other day. We only just won it. Oh God, you have no idea how close it was. Because I think that's even a step down from Len Dayton going, well, as long as we didn't lose, we won.
Yeah.
Then there's the Churchillian view, which I think the really interesting thing about the Churchillian view of the Battle of Britain is it's interpretable. It's a Cold War version because it's being served up as a sort of, look, Britain stood alone against tyranny. We have new tyranny to stand up against, and you need to stand with people who stand up against tyranny, but it's interpretable, isn't it? Because he says what he doesn't actually say is we nearly lost, does he? He says that we stood firm and that's why we won. So you can feed declinist into it, you can feed pessimist into it, you can feed an optimist view into it, I think, the Churchillian view, which shows he's a politician because he's being flexible. He's a politician writing history, so he's being flexible with an open-ended interpretation. Then there's the inevitablist school, which is people like Phillips, for whom in the Second World War there is only one battle that's in the balance, and that's the invasion of France in 1940, or David Edgerton's War Machine, where you're talking about this great big meat grinding thing, and what the British establishment has to do is turn the handle, and eventually it minces everything in front of it, so to speak. And we've talked a lot about this, and we've seen in response to Phillips talking about the few and about the myths of the Battle of Britain, and he had a good thread the other day where he really got into it. Anyway, I think it's quite interesting that there are this many schools of thought about it, rather than perhaps Normandy, where there's two. where there's the Allies were crap, the Germans were brilliant. They won basically by cheating, by having more stuff. Or the other view, which is that there's a war machine, and you're being cautious because that's the right thing to do, because you're being sensible, because you're more you've got your stuff worked out. Anyway, but so as we go into these questions, I think it's worth thinking which these reflect as we go. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I mean, the thing is the whole kind of defeatist view, the kind of sort of, we were staring down the barrel, the narrow margin, all that kind of stuff, is largely based on two things. First of all, it's going back to the strategic earthquake of the fall of France. And, even if you look by kind of middle of July 1940, the British government has got a huge amount on its plate. It now knows by this stage that I think Turkey's not going to come in on their side. There is now the Italians have gone into British Somaliland, so suddenly you've got the whole kind of war going on in East Africa, which you've got to service and deal with at some point. Then you've got the threat of the Italians moving into Egypt. You've got the threat from the Japanese in the Far East. And suddenly you've got an awful lot of spinning plates. You've got Spain, and Samuel Hoare, who is the ambassador out there, former Chancellor of Exchequer, but now ambassador is out there, is also kind of, is an absolute, this, particularly Madrid, is a kind of sort of city of spies and all the rest of it. But, it's absolutely awash with rumour, is Franco going to kind of go in with Hitler and all the rest of it, threaten Gibraltar? Are they going to have to give up the Mediterranean? Where are they going to get the tanks from? Where are they going to get the arms from and all the rest of it? There's actually quite a lot of juggle because what Britain is ready to fight a defensive air battle to a certain extent, but what it isn't ready for is global war. And
yes.
That is the strategic earthquake. And you also have to accept that at the end of May, beginning of June, everyone is just absolutely they can't believe what is going to happen, and what has happened to France and what that means. And the Germans, to someone who's not in the know, who doesn't know about how much we've got where and what kind of resources we've got and all the rest of it, it just seems so incomprehensible, because the spin that had been presented to the British people was, we'll beat Germany because we're stronger and we're bigger and we're better and we're more industrialised and all the rest of it, and we've got France. Well, France is gone, and the Nazis are kind of sort of, are on Cap Grenay and kind of staring at them from Calais. And that all seems incredibly difficult. But of course, that's then, and that is what people are thinking then. And it's very interesting when you read sort of diaries of Harold Nicholson and Vita Sackville-West and stuff, who are down at sort of Sissinghurst in Kent, so comparatively close across the channel. And they've got their cyanide pills ready, and they can't see how they can possibly win. And Harold Nicholson is a junior minister. So although he's kind of quite a big step removed from the absolute, from the war cabinet, that's his view. He's a naturally kind of slightly pessimistic person anyway, and just the odds just seem overwhelming. But of course, the role of the historian is to look at this bigger picture and take a step back, and we, looking at it from the perspective of 2020, can take away that emotion. We can take away that kind of lack of knowledge that even someone like Harold Nicholson has, or a punter, a civvy down in Dover has. And we can go, well, actually, let's look at what they've got, because we've got access to all those figures now, which your general person hasn't. So that is where that kind of... and you can see that Britain's actually got an awful lot more assets, and a lot more kind of sort of feathers in its cap than it might have seemed at the time in 1940. And we can look at it in a slightly more dispassionate way. The second reason, so that's one reason why this myth occurs, because it looks to so many people at the time that we're staring down the barrel. My argument is that although it was incredibly serious, and although there were kind of a lot of variables that could have made the situation an awful lot worse, in actual fact, it wasn't quite as bad as everyone made out. And one of the reasons why it's not so bad is, of course, because we've got the world's largest navy, because we've got this first fully coordinated air defence system, which no other country has. And so that gives a lopsided and warped view to how dangerous the Luftwaffe is. So, the Luftwaffe seems to have run, and has indeed run amok in Warsaw.
Yes, swept all before it.
Swept all before it, yeah. But that's because it hasn't come up against an air defence system before. So the rules are suddenly and dramatically different the moment that Luftwaffe takes on Britain. But if you're a British punter, you don't know about the kind of sort of arcane detail of the dowding system. You know there might be some radar on the stations on the coast, but you don't really know what they are because it's secret. So you can understand why people would feel that the Luftwaffe is unstoppable. But that is all part of the myth, because where we get that myth from is from diaries and mass observation. We've talked about that before, which was this thing that was set up where people kind of, to gauge what public opinion was. It was originally set up in the 1930s, but then became absolutely kind of essential in the an amazing resource in the Second World War. So there's all that as well, playing into it and playing into that kind of myth thing. But the other big reason is because although our intelligence is very good on the Luftwaffe, and we know what units are where pretty much, certainly by the beginning of August 1940, we assume that their Staffel, which is the basic unit equivalent to a squadron, is the same as a squadron when it isn't. Whereas a British squadron is double the size of a German Staffel, and quite often 3 times the size. And that is the big difference. So that when Dowding a Park, Park being the commander of 11 Group in southeast England, Dowding being the overall commander-in-chief of Fighter Command, when in the sort of, third week of August, the beginning of September, they're thinking that they've got frontline squadrons operating at 75% pilot strength. What they're really meaning is 16 to 18 pilots to service 12 in the air, rather than 20 to 24. Whereas 75% strength for Luftwaffe Staffeln is absolutely par for the course, and that means 9 pilots rather than 12. And that is just accepted as that is what it's going to be like. And even units like JG52 are being withdrawn from Luftwaffe from the Luftwaffe in northern France at the beginning of August. So even before Eagle Day, Adlertag, they're being withdrawn because of pilot losses.
Well, so one of the advantages Fighter Command has is it's essentially overstaffed in essence in terms of pilots, which means you lose a pilot, there's another one, and they're running this home advantage that we've talked about before anyway. That if you're shot down, you bail out over Kent, you're back on your base by supper. Anyway, right, we've a load of questions. We asked tons of questions. I mean, what we've done there was just sort of prized the lid off the can of worms, James.
Yes.
That opening bit. Right. So, I've just started, Liz J says, I've just started Eagle Day, and it notes, Sperler suggested targeting the British ports to cut off sea traffic. Would this have been more damaging for the British, and did the Germans have the resources to take the ports out of action to a significant degree? Well, I think that whatever the Germans do that offers our RAF Fighter Command an opportunity to encounter and destroy and attrit the Luftwaffe is good for Fighter Command. So if you had Sperler, if you'd followed that suggestion and you had attacked ports, it would have created an opportunity for Fighter Command to attrit the Luftwaffe. And the Luftwaffe, after all, its job is it's been designed as a tactical, army-coordinated frontline battle hammer, hasn't it?
Yeah.
It's not been designed for attacking ports. And when they do attack ports, because that does happen, when they do attack ports, it results in the Luftwaffe being attrited.
Yeah.
Doesn't it? So I don't know that it would have I don't know that they did have the resources to take the ports out of action to a significant degree, and I don't think it would have been more damaging for the British.
Well, I mean, the truth is they absolutely do attack ports. I mean, Portsmouth is absolutely smashed on the 12th of August, the day before Eagle Day, which is the day when they're trying to attack the radar stations as well. So it's the same day that Ventnor, the radar station at Ventnor, gets knocked out on the 12th of August, is the day where they get it gets really hammered at Portsmouth. There's lots of, there's Portland, of course, gets very badly hit as well. And they are hitting ports. And my old Nazi friend, Heyer Hermann, I mean, he was, you know, one day he was dropping bombs on people. The next day he was dropping mines in harbour entrances on the south coast, and even he was attacking sort of, you know, Newcastle and stuff. You know, they did go and attack Glasgow. They did attack Liverpool, and obviously that built to a crescendo in the Blitz in May 1941 when Liverpool was incredibly heavily hammered. But the truth of the matter is with the Luftwaffe is it doesn't matter how much it looks like they're sweeping all before them in Poland, in the Low Countries, in Scandinavia and France. The truth is they don't have enough of anything. And actually, let's just look at those figures for how much the Luftwaffe have. To fight on on the 3rd of August. This is what they've got available on the 3rd of August. So this is 10 days before Eagle Day, which is the all-out attack. So actual strength. So there's a difference between paper strength, which is what you've got in the notebook. And then there is combat strength, which is what is available at the various airfields you've amassed in northern France, etc., and the Low Countries. And then there is actual strength for what could actually fly on any one particular day. That is the key thing. So single-engine fighters are 760, which is it's a bit ahead of Fighter Command, but not by much. Twin-engine fighters, 230. So there's not many Messerschmitt 110s. They have a role to play, but it's not, frankly, much of one. Bombers, 823. 823 twin-engine bombers is a lot on one level, but certainly by the end of the war, that is not enough. Okay, so and then there's a further 343 dive bombers, i.e. Stukas, which are within 3 weeks will be completely withdrawn from the battle. So that is quite interesting because basically you've got around 2,100 planes available on that day. And actually, total bomber command strength is about, actual strength on that day is about 1,600. But in terms of fighters, probably only about 700, 720, something like that. Which is, so obviously fighter command is outnumbered, but not the RAF full stop. So it depends on what you're judging. But what we're interested in is bombers, because it's bombers that are going to cause the destruction. Bombers are going to destroy ports or lay mines in ports, and it's bombers that can destroy airfields and destroy aircraft on the ground and all the rest of it. 1,823 plus 343 dive bombers, that is just not enough to do what you want to do against the whole of Britain.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you consider what it takes to later on in the war, what it takes to destroy Hamburg in 1943,
3,500 aircraft, heavy 3
bombers,
days, 4-engine bombers.
Yeah, and it non-stop for days. Anyway, right. So I think so. What that question sort of prizes open is the question of parity and strength, and so any opportunity that Fighter Command is given to attrit the Luftwaffe is from the Fighter Command's point of view a good one, and
yes,
because the Luftwaffe simply isn't strong enough to. I mean, supposedly the thing we talked about earlier, the 2 phases of the battle, knocking out RAF stations, RDF rather, and then switching to cities. The Luftwaffe hasn't got the capability to knock out RDF. It hasn't got the capability to knock out fighter stations, not really. And a concerted effort, each concerted effort exposes it to further destruction. And the remarkable thing about this, of course, is this is the first proper full-on air supremacy battle, isn't it? So everyone's learning and figuring this out. And one of the things that everyone learns from this is you can't do this unless you completely overwhelm the enemy. Whichever side you are, you have to completely overwhelm. And it's more than traditionally the land forces. It's 3-1, isn't it, to ensure an attack goes well? It's more than that with aircraft.
Minimum of 3-1, and they've barely got that. That's the thing. I mean, the other thing I think it's really worth pointing out is that the Luftwaffe has grown organically to give direct support to ground operations. So it is, by that terms, is what we call a tactical air force, or offering close air support. Whereas in the Battle of Britain, it is suddenly being expected to operate as a strategic air force, i.e., one that's operating on its own without influence of the Navy or the ground forces. And that's a role that it's just not been designed to do. So what you get an awful lot of, particularly in the early part of the battle, is a lot of sort of head scratching, not knowing quite what to do. And so it's worth just mentioning probably that, from officially the Battle of Britain starts on 10th of July. And that first bit is them kind of probing away, kind of attacking channel shipping, that kind of stuff. Because at that point we still had East Coast convoys going up and down the East Coast. That was later kind of stopped, and we just thought, okay, well, we'll just use the kind of southwest ports and we'll use the western ports instead. But, sometimes they're kind of thinking, well, let's send over a few and do a bit of mine laying, and let's do a bit of bombing, and let's do a little bit of that. And what they're not doing is what the Germans are not doing, even in that first part of the Battle of Britain, or indeed at any part of the Battle of Britain, they're not obeying their own doctrine, which is that of the Schwerpunkt, which is exactly what you were saying, Al, which is about concentration of force and overwhelming the enemy at the point you want to hit. So what they should have done, my own view, is if they were going to do it, they just need to pummel Kent. They just need to kind of focus on those ports and not try going anywhere else. They need to just mass everything against one bit. And that's what they're doing. It's a bit something and nothing and a bit bitty. And actually that continues throughout the Battle of Britain. Even on Battle of Britain Day, September the 15th, Sunday the 15th of September 1940, you've still got little raids in the morning, even though they've got these two little concentrated raids. There's still little forays and people kind of doing recce trips and all sorts of... It all smacks of a command that doesn't quite know what it should be doing.
Yeah. Well, because after all... no one expected to be in this situation, least of all the Germans. No. Nobody. The reason they don't have a strategic air force is because they weren't expecting to need one yet.
No.
It's all happened for everybody. Everyone is... we talked earlier on about how the British are thinking, oh my God, what a mess we find ourselves in. But everyone effectively thinking that. And the Luftwaffe... of course, it belies the reputation for German efficiency. Is the Luftwaffe are improvising like mad, and a lot of it doesn't work. Which of course, if we're feeding these national myths into it, the Germans are terribly efficient and reliable, and everything's worked out. In this instance, that is just not the case. And you've got fighter escorts setting off for bomber groups that aren't there. The whole thing going on like that, and arguably chaos. Let's move on to another question, because we were going to rattle through these because there's loads of them, but what we've done, as ever, it's distracted ourselves.
It's got a little bit sidetracked.
Sidetracked. Jamie McTrusty says, and Jamie's a regular. I think he's on our Patreon. We see his name from time to time. What are your views on attacks on Luftwaffe air-sea rescue aircraft? Were they reporting on coastal convoys as claimed, or was this a cover to deny the Germans a chance to recover their aircrew? They definitely wanted to deny the Germans a chance to recover their aircrew. Dowding was absolutely dispassionate about that.
Didn't mince his words about it at all, did he?
Yeah, every pilot that gets away is a win for the enemy. So, no, and even if they are reporting on coastal convoys, you don't want them to report on coastal convoys, do you? You want to shoot them down, stop them doing that, deny them that information as well. So. Yeah,
I personally think it's, under the kind of situation of the time, it's entirely justified. You've got an enemy vessel on the ground or an airplane that's operating in British airspace or on British waters, trying to rescue pilots so that they can attack Britain again. Shoot the bastards.
Right, I'll tell you what, I'll jump ahead one and then go back. So, because this I think is related. Wargamer CC says, how low was too low for a pilot to bail out successfully?
Well,
that's a good question, isn't it?
That is a very good question.
It depends how fast you're going as your Spitfire or Hurricane is hurtling down.
I don't know. Yes. I would have thought kind of 500 feet. It's not. You wouldn't want to much lower than that, would you?
500 feet probably, but if because if you're doing 500 miles an hour because you were fatally attacked at 15,000 feet,
plummeting earthwards.
Plummeting, exactly. Are you
500
even going to
feet
get
probably not going to be enough,
open?
Is it? No,
probably isn't going to be enough. So I don't know. Is the answer to that? Those chutes they're like a reserve, aren't they? So they've got a big spring in them that bang fires the thing open, aren't they? Are they like that, or are they?
Yes, I think so. I think no. I think they've got to. You've got to. No, there's a thing you've got to tug. There's a pull. You have to. But you just think what you've got to do. What you're supposed to do to get out is obviously pull back the canopy, but that doesn't come back at a certain speed. It's very difficult to get open because, of course, forces of gravitational pull and all the rest of it. So what you really want to do is be in a kind of nice level gliding, in a level situation. You then have to kind of sort of undo your radio leads, then your oxygen leads, pull open the canopy, invert the plane, and you just drop out. And in those circumstances, it's absolutely fine. But if your plane's on fire and you're diving, you've basically still got, you've got to still undo your radio leads, take out your oxygen mask, get over the canopy, invert yourself and pull out. And if you don't do it in that time that I've just described what you've got to do, you're going to fry. So it's and it's particularly bad in a hurricane, for example, because they have the fuel tanks at the wing roots. And it's actually, everyone always sort of assumes it's a fuel tank above your legs that's the big trouble. The real problem is that you've got these fuel tanks at the wing roots, and once you've fired your guns, you've got these eight machine gun ports quite close together on each wing. And of course, the air then goes into those holes through the machine guns and fans the flames up into the cockpit. And that's why the Hurricane is so completely brutal. Particularly bad, you know. I mean, obviously, any plane you can burn to death in it, but that's why the Hurricane is particularly bad. So it's very, very difficult.
It's just really difficult. We're going to take a brief break. We'll be back in a second with more of your questions. It's all terrifying, James. That's the key note here. We'll see you in a tick. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. We're trying to get through your Battle of Britain questions. I have a feeling that we are not going to be able to do all of this in one episode, and we'll be talking about this again shortly, or even forever.
What a shame. What a shame. What, we'll have to do another episode on the Battle of Britain next Tuesday. Drat.
Right, Graham McCulloch asks, my gran, who was in the ATS, greatly admired General Sir Frederick Pyle, who was in charge of anti-aircraft command. How effective was ACAC?
Yes, well, to start off with, not terribly, because they didn't have enough of it, and they had to have these rules where they all had to fire the guns as much as possible, even if they weren't firing at targets, for the morale of the people, to make it sound like there were more guns than there actually were. One thing I would say about Frederick Pyle, though, he was pretty switched on dude, and he shared he was at Bentley Priory, so he was at Fighter Command headquarters so that they could coordinate with Fighter Command. Their operations, and actually, it was from Bentley Priory that they signalled the sirens as well. So you know that was decision. Okay, right, fire the sirens now.
Wait a second, are we talking Army and RAF cooperation in 1940?
Can you believe it? Yeah, and Dowding and Pyle really got on. They really liked each other, and which obviously helps enormously. But yeah, so it was pretty ineffective to start off with, and got more and more effective. I mean. You know, I remember. In the just to sort of switch it back over to Germany. I mean, you know, there's sort of 15,000 anti-aircraft guns in the Greater Reich. You know, in the Third Reich by early 1944, and I think there's something like a 0.002% chance of hitting something. So you've got to fire something like 3,500 shells before you know, statistically. So it's incredibly difficult to hit, even with advances in sort of gun-laying radar. So the idea is that you have this radar that tracks it, which then sends information back down to the gun crew, and then predicts where you need to fire, because obviously you've got the time, you've got the motion of the plane going forward, and you've got the time it takes for the shell to reach that target. So, you know, you can understand why it's so difficult. The most effective way to shoot down a bomber, without any shadow of doubt whatsoever, is in a fighter plane. But what's really interesting is this is one of where that rule slightly changes, of course, is with dive bombers, and that's the whole point of dive bombers, is that they're getting down really low so that they're more accurate. But the lower they're getting, the easier they are to hit. Which is why over Malta, for example, by 1942, you've got these box barrages, and the whole idea of a box barrage is that you've got these. You've got a density of anti-aircraft guns, all kind of ranged to detonate at a different place, so that as a dive bombing point of view, you are going into this sort of cube, this cube in this sort of invisible cube, where you're just going to be going through vast amounts of flak and steel fragments and all the rest of it. And of course, it's incredibly dangerous, which is why Maltese gunners managed to shoot down 102 German planes in April 1942 alone. But that sort of rate of attrition is not being achieved anything like that in 1940 over London or elsewhere.
I mean, it's partly sort of about denial, isn't it, ACAC, as much as anything else? Is that you know there's somewhere stiff with ACAC, so you go somewhere else maybe.
Yes, and it's also a big part of it is to show that the people down below, the people who are suffering all these bombing, that actually there's a whole load of stuff
that something's being done.
Something's being done, yeah.
Okay, Lydia Jane asks, can we hear more about the battles fought down the coast of northeast England? This area was bombed heavily during August 1940 from Luftwaffe bases in Norway, repelled by fighters from RAF Usworth, Sunderland and Acklington, Northumberland. Rarely gets talked about. Well, I suppose, I mean, it's in the story of the Battle of Britain, it is very much presented as a sideshow, isn't it? I mean, you get that big raid where they send no fighter cover, don't they? And everyone
Sheffield.
on the northeast coast,
when they go to Flamborough Head on the 15th of August.
Yeah, that's right. And everyone on the northeast coast gets a chance to have a go at shooting down Germans rather than
including our old friend Cocky Dundas, who's with 616 Squadron. We talked about him a little bit, I think, when we were doing Dunkirk. And I've just been writing about him again for Sicily. So it's amazing what a war he had. He ended up being the youngest group captain in the RAF, by the way, by Italy. He was 23. But in the Battle of Britain, so he's up at Leconfield with 616 Squadron. That is Air Fleet 5, which is based in Norway. They've only got about 270 aircraft in total. No single engine fighters, I don't think. I think they're all kind of Dorniers and Junkers and Heinkels and a handful of ME-110 twin engine fighters. Because they haven't the single engine fighters haven't got the range, obviously, to go all the way to Britain from there. So inevitably, they're going to be largely coming over unescorted, almost entirely unescorted. And so these Junkers 88s come over on the 15th of August, for example, and they think they're going to have an easy ride, and are absolutely horrified to discover that suddenly there's all these fighters, these British fighters, have been scrambled to come and intercept them. I mean, it's not what they're expecting at all. They do manage to hit Driffield, and they do actually shoot up 10 Whitleys on the ground. And knock out a couple of hangars, but they lose something like 13 aircraft or something shot down. And, it is very much kind of sort of Fighter Command 2, Luftwaffe 1, on that day.
Yeah.
And it sort of disproves Leo McKinstry's point, and it also proves the value of what Dowding's system is, which is that it doesn't matter how bad things are, every group needs its squadrons. So the country is divided into these groups, and that means that airfields in Drem outside Edinburgh, or Dice, or Acklington and Northumberland, or indeed Leconfield or wherever, Leconfield, they do have full fighter squadrons there. And obviously you've got a much greater density of fighter squadrons in the southeast and southwest and around London, but you've still got these squadrons throughout the country. And I think it's really important for precisely that reason.
Well, because Newcastle is the home of Vickers Armstrong, after all. So you're
exactly that. And Glasgow,
and
you've got Greenock and the docks and all the rest of it.
Yeah, and ICI in Cleveland and all that sort of stuff. I mean, if we're talking defending your military-industrial complex, what you absolutely don't do is strip your fighter squadrons out of protecting where your tank building and where your armaments industry is, because Newcastle is a massive scientific and military centre. And obviously, the action is the action is around London primarily at the second half of the Battle of Britain, really. But what RAF Fighter Command is doing is protecting all its national assets. Is the idea. I suppose in the end, because there isn't a titanic struggle for that part of the northeast coast like there is in the southeast. It doesn't get into the story, I think, is the thing. It's a bit one-sided, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose it is. But, that raid, that's the last big raid that the Luftwaffe try kind of, during daylight hours in the Battle of Britain, in the northeast. So it sort of, to me, that is just confirms the rightness of Dowding's strategy.
Yeah. Yes, the Luftwaffe are defeated.
That's the 15th of August. That's 2 days after Eagle Day. It's the very start of the air battle, so the all-out air battle. It's not great that they're already going to go. Okay, so that bit of the plan doesn't work. Never mind. We'll just focus on we'll go to Plan B, which is kind of not worry about do large scale raids from Norway.
Yeah.
But basically, what you're doing in a trice, you've just taken out of action 270 aircraft, which is part of your arsenal. So instead of having 2,100 aircraft anymore, you've now got 1,800 aircraft and 1,850 available.
And they're not going to redeploy them to Pas-de-Calais, make them available to the new balance of effort.
No,
they're not going to do that.
No, because they're part of a different air fleet and air fleet
exactly.
Stays
exactly.
And then on, I think it's around the 23rd of August, they withdraw the dive bombers because they're getting absolutely slaughtered. So you've just taken away another 240, so let's get 350 for argument's sake. So you've now taken out 350, 250, 700 of your aircraft. So you're now down from 2,100 aircraft down to, 1,400. And that's against 700. And now it's 2-1, not 3-1, by within 10 days of the launch of the all-out attack.
Right, now, Carl Reed asks, and this used to bug me when I was making my airfix models, what was the reason that Spitz and Hurricanes were so lightly armed? 303 guns seem so silly. Did they upgrade the weapons during the battle, or was it after? Or if after, what sort of armaments do later Mark Spitfires has? Well, they go up to cannon pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But they're running tests, aren't they, during the Battle of Britain on Spitfires with cannon? But it's all about fitting it in the wing, and the narrow wing, and the Spitfire in particular. I mean, the Hurricane's actually better suited as a larger gun compartment because it's got that chunky monkey wing. It's fitting it the Spit, but it's basically money, isn't it? It's money.
No, I think it's more drag and weight, I think, is the issue with cannons. Because although you've got 8 machine guns rather than, say, 2 cannons, it's this concern that their cannons are too big and there isn't enough of them. So that if you have a cannon, you can only pack in kind of 80 cannon shells as opposed to hundreds of rounds of machine gun ammunition. And of course, what the solution is to have a combination of the two, which is what the ME-109E does, and what subsequent some marks of Spitfire do have just cannons, but for the most part, for the end of the war, it's a mixture of cannons and machine guns. I mean, it's interesting because there is this report that's in the archives up at RAF Cranwell, dating from, I think it's 1926, and it says, and it's about armaments of fighter planes, and it says, whatever you do not use a .303 Browning machine gun. It's like you're firing with a pea shooter. But there's very good reasons for doing it because, of course, they fit in the wings, in a way that a cannon doesn't. And it is interesting because, ME-109E, for example, it has 80 cannon shells. But it has 55 seconds worth of ammunition, machine gun ammunition. Whereas the combined, when you fire your machine guns, you're firing in a Hurricane or a Spitfire. You're firing 8. You're not firing. You can't just sort of fire one and take it in turns. You're firing all 8 together, and that's supposed to give it 8 machine guns in a cone. In a concentrated hole is the impact of a cannon. But obviously you've got to get it at exactly the point of convergence, and that's very difficult to do because you're judging it by your eyesight and all the rest of it. And so it rarely, rarely happens. And very famously, 74 Squadron fires something like 7,500 rounds of ammunition at a Dornier 17, still doesn't shoot it down. But that's, of course, early on in the battle where they're still firing these, so the original tactics were these 6 styles of attack that you would do. And they're all very organised and they all look very beautiful and stuff, but completely impractical when it actually push comes to shove. And of course, what everyone realised was that it was Dowding's dictum that machine guns had to be harmonised. I think it was either 400 yards or 450 yards. And everyone just sort of ignored it after a while, and so started harmonising them at 200 yards or 250, or sometimes even 150 yards. I mean, what they realised very quickly as the Battle of Britain progressed was that the only way to shoot down a plane is getting in really, really,
really close.
Really close. But obviously they do develop this later on, and they overcome these problems. But I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that later on in the war you've got P-47s and P-51 Mustangs, American fighter planes. They don't have cannons. They've got 50 caliber machine guns.
No, but it's 50 cals, isn't it?
Yeah. But they're still machine guns. So, and I think the other thing to remember is that in 1940 people were still trying to work their way out with air power. What does it involve? There is this realization that the fast, all metal monoplane is the way forward, but that's only recently kind of had traction. Up until then, it's not about speed, it's about maneuverability. And that's the whole kind of sort of moving all around, dancing all around the sky stuff. What the Germans work out is that with the ME-109E, the 3 things you need to do is climb very fast. You need to get height. And if you've got height, that means you can maneuver around the sky with the sun behind you. And dive on your enemy, your unsuspecting enemy. Pack a massive punch when you get there, which they can do with their 55 seconds worth of machine gun ammunition and their cannons as well. And the really skilled pilot, of course, because they've got tracers, so what you'd have is every 5th bullet would have a little kind of phosphorescence on it so you could see it going across the sky. So the really good pilot, what they would do is that you have 2 gun buttons on the Messerschmitt 109. What you would do is you get your bead with your machine gun, And then when you got it, you just got one single cannon shell, because you can fire it continuously or singularly on the 109, and that does the trick.
Yeah,
but not a lot of people have that skill. That's the
you walk your fire in if you were good at it, wouldn't you? You wouldn't have to necessarily rely on a deflection sight and all that sort of thing.
No, but I mean, don't forget the other thing is how do you practice air gunnery?
Well, with great difficulty.
With great difficulty, which is why most people are just absolutely useless shots. So and that's again why you need this advantage of height and speed, because then you can just go directly right behind them, right up their arse, and just shoot them out of the sky, and that's the easiest way to do it.
Now, Fionn Duffield asks, what was the Germans' real understanding of our radar at the time? Or RDF. I'm a stickler for that. They attacked them early on, but then seemed to stop. Their own development of radar later in the war must have given them some idea of its importance. Well, the Germans had radar. They had it, and they had neat, tidy, little boxed-up radar in the way that the British didn't. And in fact, RDF looked so peculiar and unlike radar, or unlike a radio direction finding device, the Germans didn't recognise it for what it was to start with, did they? They thought, what are these great big aerials along the English coast? Who knows? Who knows what they're up to? They didn't know. They didn't clock it for what it was, did they? And sent Zeppelin flights in late.
I think they did think it was some kind of early warning system, but they discounted it as not very effective because they look so awful and so unsophisticated compared to. I mean, if you look at sort of a Freyr or Würzburg from 1940, it's the dish, the lattice work dish that rotates 360 degrees and looks like what you imagine in your mind's eye a radar station to look like of the 1980s or something. So it looks much more kind of up to speed technically, and indeed it was. And but these, of course, were developed by the Navy rather than the Kriegsmarine, rather than the Luftwaffe, and there wasn't much sort of cross pollination. But they thought that these huge 270 foot high and 360 foot high masts, because you've got the receivers and the people that you've got the masts that's sending out the signals, then you've got the ones that are receiving the pushback, and they're different heights, but they look incredibly awkward. So you would always have kind of 6 masts, lattice work masts per radar station. On chain home, and then there's the chain home low, which is this kind of slightly more accurate, smaller thing, but the range is less. And the Germans looked at this; they called it DT, and they looked at it and just thought, they're so archaic. It's so kind of prehistoric compared to what we've got. How big a threat can they be? So Goering orders all-out attacks on the RDF stations, on the DT stations, on the 12th of August as a precursor to Eagle Day, a sort of warm-up act, and. Again, the British have thought about this, so they've realised that they're going to send out fake radio signals, even if they have been knocked out. So Ventnor gets knocked out, but the Germans don't realise they've knocked it out. And they go, well, actually, it's quite difficult knocking these things out, isn't it? So should we just not bother? And everyone goes, yeah, sod it. We'll just mow them down. It'll be fine. And so that's the end of it, and that's the end of their attacks on radar stations.
The thing is even. All the reserve stations and all the sort of redundancies built into the RDF system anyway meant that the thing is the Luftwaffe has got too many jobs to try and do if it's to achieve what its objective seems to be. If it's got to knock out the RDF, it's got to knock out fighter stations. It's got lots to do and hasn't got the means to do all of them. And anyway, as we've said before, it's making up as it goes along and doesn't really have a very clear picture of what's happening in the UK anyway. In fact, hasn't got a clear picture at all of what Fighter Command amounts to in terms of the resources it has at its disposal, with the observation corps and all that sort of stuff. They don't know, do they?
No.
And so, and even if you had knocked out, let's say you'd put the RDF out of commission for a week, you've still got the observation corps, you've still got, and of course, the conjecture I've made there is impossible anyway, because there's too much RDF to take out effectively. Even then, how are they going to be able to do that and then exploit on that and also capitalise on that and then anyway, how are they going to cope with the attrition that will be built up in each stage of this sort of multifaceted battle that they're trying to pull off?
Yeah,
that's the issue, isn't it? Again, I mean, it is really interesting, isn't it? The realisation they've bitten off more than they can chew comes in at the sort of Staffel level. They realise it, don't they? Soon enough.
Yeah.
But it's getting it all the way up to Goering, who then has to go and tell Hitler,
Neither of whom want to hear this.
No one wants to hear this. Of course.
So constantly, because no one wants to, because the higher you get up the chain of the Nazi elite, the less people want to be imparting bad news. They're putting on this gloss on things and saying, "Oh, no, it's all fine. You know, they're inches away from surrendering or inches away from breaking them." So they're being dishonest to themselves because they don't want to be the one to tell Goering that it's all an absolute shit show. And this is why Adolf Galland famously kind of stands up to Goering, because he's so far down the chain. He feels that it doesn't matter. It matters. It still takes guts to do that, but he can tell a few more home truths. But Goering does this thing throughout the Battle of Britain where, the 15th of August is an absolute classic case, because I think it's the day where the Luftwaffe lose the most planes. It's either that or the 18th, I can't remember. But the initial orders that day are, the weather's going to be bad, so let's not have any orders. And one of the big problems is that Luftwaffe 2 has this underground bunker, which is kind of weird when you're an Air Force commander. I mean, why? That can only be because you're scared that the RAF is going to come over and bomb you. So they have this underground bunker, so they can't see the sky. So the orders are no flying today on the 15th. And then, they have Dykman, who is the operations officer, the chief of staff. He comes up and he goes, "Look, it's a beautiful day. What are we doing? I'm going to countermand this." And then Rykhoff, who is the one of the staff officers, then countermands it, and then Dykman then goes, "No, sod it, I'm going to do it anyway." And Rykhoff goes, "But you're mad, doing this, to take it, going against the orders from the top. This comes all the way from Goering. You sure you want to do it?" And he goes, "Sod it, I'm just going to take a punt. We've got to do it. This is such a beautiful day. We've got to go for it." And so they do, but it means that they're late being organised. It's a bit piecemeal. When they do finally get going, the kind of initiative's gone. Meanwhile, that same very day, Goering has ordered all his senior commanders back to Karenhall, which is sort of northeast of Berlin. I mean, how unhelpful is that 2 days into the battle when they should, Goering should be going to the Pas de Calais, not the other way around.
Yeah.
Bonkers. It's absolutely bonkers. There's no way to fight a battle at all.
Well, this is no way to make a podcast either, because I've just scrolled through all the questions, and we've another 20 questions to do. And
so we're going to have to do part 2 next week, aren't we?
6. So we're going to have to do part 2 next week.
And then part 4.
Yeah. Yeah, this will run and run.
Happy days.
Happy days. Thanks everyone for listening. There will be more Battle of Britain. We haven't yet committed our full reserve to that one. We'll be right. One little bit of info. We will not be live streaming on the Patreon on Thursday. It's the summer holidays. James is in Cornwall somewhere, I think, undisclosed location.
Yeah.
And the Wi-Fi is worse there than it is in the south of France like last week. So there'll be no Toad this week. Although if you want to hear the Toad, here he is. There we go.
I love it. It is Aztec.
It's the Aztec
Toad.
Toad.
The Toad. It's absolutely
Anyway, thanks for all of you who watched that on the Patreon. This is it for this week, but we'll be back with more Battle of Britain next week. That's a promise. Thanks very much. Thanks for listening. Cheerio.
Cheers.